Have you ever wondered what the key differences are between surfers of all different levels? Well, it turns out there's a key thread no matter where you're starting from beginner to intermediate to advanced, and even from the advanced to the professional levels of surfing. Today, what I'd like to do is actually take you through the journey of a longboarder and building a framework of a key realization that is really important to move between these experience and competence levels. Please watch to the end because the breakdown of each of these different components is super important to understand for our surfing progression. And there's a fair bit to unpack here, including the overall framework and the skill sets that you'll need and will be required to move yourself from each phase to another. If you're enjoying this, finding it valuable and you haven't already, please feel free to subscribe. But my name is Ben Considine and this is the Sunday Glide. So today we're going to be breaking down the framework which underpins how to use the longboard most effectively. And this will definitely help your surfing and improve your progression immensely. But first, I wanted to give you a bit of background as to why it's so important. So, surfing progression is often thought about as improving the maneuvers that you can do, but this really is only half of the equation, and I think this is especially the case for longboarding. There's a couple of really key examples that I think I'd like to share with you today, which really help to strengthen this argument and I guess give us a bit of context as to why this is the case. The first one is an interesting podcast that I heard from Kanoa Igarashi on the WSL podcast, The Lineup, where he was describing how there was a pivotal transitional moment for his surfing where he went from being really good at his maneuvers but stepping into that next really advanced higher level of surfing. There was a heat out at J Bay that he credits this with, and it's where he was really focusing on the in-between moments, and he says this, where he was focusing on flow between turns and how he was setting up the wave as a whole, rather than just the maneuvers that he was completing. More recently, we also heard a really good podcast from CJ Nelson that he did with the Surf Splendor podcast, and he was speaking about some really interesting things, and I highly recommend that you give that podcast a listen because there's a variety of things that are covered that are really important and interesting to listen to. But with respect to the surfing element that he was speaking about, interesting to hear him talk about what was most important in longboarding. And he said that the most important in longboarding is restraint, which is a fascinating concept because this isn't the ability to do the biggest maneuver, it's not the ability to complete the most amount of maneuvers, it's that less is more attitude that they're developing on the wave, and how this is a really pivotal and important aspect of longboarding. Restraint. Something that's been on my mind a lot recently and over the past year or so, how to get to that next level, and I think to hear someone of that caliber articulated in this way was really nice, and it's going to feed into what we do today in the video, so I think it's a good thing to keep in mind when we're explaining this framework, which let's get into that now. So the first thing to begin with here is understanding what the differences are in our progressions of surfing. I like to think about it as anything from beginner to the advanced levels of surfing. The amount of maneuvers and the ability to complete those maneuvers competently, that goes up quite a lot. Everything from the advanced to the professional level does seem to be a little bit more about positioning on the wave, how we read the wave, and positioning of ourselves on the board. And so that's the crux of what I wanted to go through today. Positioning on the board. How this matters from everything from a beginner to a professional level surfer, and how this varies throughout these different stages, and the things that you need to keep in mind and should be using as a checklist to move within these different levels of surfing. Alright, so let's get into the whole point of the video. What we're going to do is break down that really good realization that I had a few years back and the fundamental framework that I'd like to get your surfing built off. It's going to underpin what you're doing as a beginner surfer all the way through to as a professional, so I think it's a really good thing to be able to understand. But essentially, it's the rule of thirds with respect to the board. But what I like to do for a longboard, which is very different from a shortboard, is actually break it down into 3 different components. This is going to be, and sorry, this is a board that I spent way too long drawing. It's not very good, but it'll do for today. But what we're going to do is break it down into thirds. So we're going to have the middle third, the tail or the back third, and then the front third, which of course is where all of the nose riding is going to happen. Now, we need to do different things in these different thirds depending on the part of the wave we're in and depending on the maneuvers that we're trying to complete as well. Where we get stuck a lot of the time between progressing from one level of surfing to another is we're not actually utilizing the board in the right way. So it's really, really important to make sure we know the use and practical component of each part of the board and make sure we're utilizing it as effectively as possible, which is something that you see the best of the best doing really, really well. Now, the middle of the board is where we're going to be getting all of our speed, and it's where we're also maintaining all of our balance. Beginner surfers are likely to start in this position because it is the most balanced. Say if we're in the whitewater, we're going to be really well balanced and we're going to be going as fast as we can as well, which is what we need as a beginner surfer. Now, this isn't only for the beginners though. As traditional longboarders, what we do want to do is make sure that we're always coming here to be gaining our speed. Something which can happen from time to time, especially if we're transitioning from a shortboard to a longboard, is we tend to sit on the tail far too long, and we might even try to generate speed from the tail, which again, with a longboard, especially our traditional longboards or logs, we don't need to do this, and it's actually pretty ineffective in maintaining as much speed as we can. So we need to come into the middle third. Now, we use the tail, of course, for turning. We can't be in the middle of the board or up the front if we're going to turn, obviously, because we won't have that pivot point. The pivot point is over the tail, and that's where we're going to get the most reactive component of our turning. So if we want to bring our turns back and make them as dynamic as possible, we need that foot to be as close to the fin as possible. Now, if we bring it right over the fin, sometimes that can be too much for the section that we're in. So we don't always need to be directly over it, just as long as we understand that we need to be close to that pivot point. And lastly, the nose is where all of our nose riding is going to happen, okay? But if we stay here for too long, then obviously this isn't what we want because we're probably going to nosedive. And so the lovely thing about longboarding is there's a really nice interplay between going from the middle of the board to gain speed to make sure we're balanced, all the way back to the tail, cross-stepping 2 steps back to make a big turn happen, and then cross-stepping back into middle to accelerate out of that turn, not sitting on the tail where we might lose speed and bog a rail. And then of course going to the front of the board when we notice we're coming into a critical section to execute a really, really tight critical nose ride, and then again back to the middle, back to the tail to cut back to wind us into the hook. This is the way I love to think about these different thirds and how we're going to be positioning ourselves on the board based on the part of the wave that we're on and the maneuvers that we want to be doing. I absolutely love this framework, so I hope it can work for your surfing. But not only that, let's delve into why this is so important throughout the different aspects of your surfing, from the beginner through to the professional level. Let's dive into that now. Now, in terms of the mistakes that we often see here as well, I thought I'd add, is that usually our problems come from not completing maneuvers in the right third of the board. And so quite often what we see with people starting out their surfing is they'll be a little bit in between that middle and back third. And so they're going to be trying to accelerate, or they might be trying to turn, but they're actually in between the two different sections rather than being right in the middle to accelerate or gain speed, and then right on the tail with their back foot to turn. They might be somewhere in between these 2 points and have their back foot here and the front foot there. And so that might be really, really difficult because if you lean forwards, you're still sort of on the tail, but as you go to commit a turn, your foot isn't far enough towards the fin to make the turn happen properly. And so this is a big thing that a lot of surfers get stuck with. And this is where we need to start to learn to execute different methods of moving up and down the board, which is what we'll get into now. All right, so as we discussed, what we're going to do now is figure out how to use this framework to advance your surfing in the different components or the different levels, from beginner to intermediate to advanced, all the way through to professional. Let's start with beginner. So the key for the beginner is figuring out how to utilize the middle of the board for speed and the tail for turning. And this is how you step into that intermediate phase. Again, as we spoke about before, the biggest barrier that we see with beginner surfers is they're within the 2/3 here. So they're never really committed into the middle third for speed and balance. They're never really committed into the back third. And there's a reason for this, because their pop-up usually lands them in one position, and then they can't deviate from this because they haven't quite learned the positioning or how to change their position on the board with the various ways that we can do this. So the first component for a beginner surfer in terms of positioning on the board is they need to figure out, firstly, how to do a pop-up not only into the middle of the board, which is where a lot of beginners start so that they have that stability in the middle where they can accelerate, but they also need to learn how to pop up on the tail. This is really important because as we start to take on various waves, we need to be able to turn the board more quickly and more readily from the beginning, and we can't do that from the middle. The other thing that we need to really learn to do is make sure we can actually shift our feet backwards and forwards on the board. Now, some might use some shuffling for this in the early stages, which early days I think is okay because it gives us a good idea for how the board feels through these different parts of the board, but we really want to be steadily working towards your cross-stepping when you are ready for that. Other ways that we can manipulate our feet on the board to help out with this is by adopting a wider stance or by simply putting the back foot a bit further back, so widening that stance to place that back foot onto the tail properly so that we can execute a turn better. So I thought I'd write this down as well. So for the beginner, it's going to be firstly the pop up to make sure that we can pop up in the middle as well as on the tail. It's also going to be utilizing the cross step or a shuffle in the early stages to shift you from the middle of the board to the tail and vice versa. So I'll just say that as walking. So they're the two really important components to make sure you're getting on top of as a beginner to move you through to the intermediate stage. Now let's talk about intermediate surfing. Now, with respect to intermediate surfing, the key is a more seamless transition backwards and forwards. And we'll get into this in a second. But essentially, we've learned how to cross step in that intermediate stage. And so to move us through to the experienced phase or to the advanced phase, this needs to be very seamless and we need to be able to do this with ease, very comfortably, and in more critical sections. So for this one, just write seamless transitions. And so what we also start to do is actually utilize the top third of the board in this intermediate phase, which will then allow us to progress through to the advanced levels of surfing. So we're starting to nose ride, we're starting to be able to lock in the hang fives and hang tens in the hook. And this of course means that we're going to be really, really competent moving up to the nose in these critical sections. And then of course back from the nose, making sure we can stabilize ourselves on our cross step backwards, which is another thing altogether. So we need to make sure that we're cross stepping comfortably and that we're now making use of the nose. So once we get competent with all of these, again, other things that'll feed into this is being able to put our board more on rail. That's a beautiful part of longboarding, and that's something that'll definitely step us into that advanced level of surfing. Now, as you've probably noticed, all of these things that we're working on with the thirds of the board and where to be and the different levels of progression that we've talked about has been moving us from the beginner level all the way through to the intermediate, from the intermediate all the way through to the advanced. And then we need to speak about how we get to this advanced to the professional level. Now, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, over the past few years, thinking about what are the ways to progress and improve, and it does come down to a fair extent to making sure that we can commit our maneuvers and our nose rides a lot better, but it relies a lot on some more intricate details, things like positioning. And I think this is a really, really important key thing to focus on, not only in that advanced level, but also having a good understanding of what we're doing regarding this in the beginner to intermediate phases, because it really does set up our sights on where we want to be and the sort of things that we need to be considering. Now, this is certainly a framework that I wish I had from the start. I've kind of over the years learnt more and more and thought more about what needs to be where and how these things should progress, and I think this is a really, really good template to build your surfing off. And so what we're actually going to do in 2 weeks' time is we're going to do a part 2 considering how we can use this template to advance our surfing from that experience or advanced level through to the professional stages, and how we incorporate this and think about this in the beginner, intermediate, and experienced phases as well. So keep an eye out for that one. It's going to be a really, really good video, and again, something I definitely wish I knew earlier on. And so that'll be coming out in 2 weeks' time. The next week, I'm super, super excited and grateful to be able to share a video with you, which is launching the new surfboard model, the Nova Pro that I've launched with South Coast Surfboards and Chizza in Chisholm at South Coast Surfboards. It's a model that we've been working on for a fair while now, and we'll go through not only an explanation of what the board is, how it's surfing, and an edit of the surfing, but we did a launch night a couple of days ago, which is super fun at the South Coast store, and we're going to have the live talks and the discussion around the board design that happened there, which is going to be epic. So can't wait to bring that to you next week. Hope this has been useful today. If you have any questions about it, please leave them in the comments below and we can discuss that together. But otherwise, I hope you're getting waves, and we'll catch you on the next one.